Hello and welcome, but once again not to the garden because I am indoors for this job, and it's just as well. There's a big old freeze out there at the moment. It is really chilly today, so I'm going to tackle one of the big sowing events of our calendar, and that's the chilies, peppers and aubergines. Now I know quite a few gardeners will have already got these going. Timing of this is actually a little bit tricky because if you think about when you want the plants, that varies by at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 or even 4 weeks, depending on the season. So if we've got a nice warm period at the end of spring here, we could sometimes get these plants in the greenhouses even the last week of April. I think generally speaking, you wouldn't rely on that here. You'd expect to plant in early May, but in a really cold year, you need to push that into the middle or latter half of May. And of course, further north, those dates shift. So there's variability at that end, and at the front end, there's variability in time to germinate. Lots of seed are fairly reliable in germination times, but the peppers and especially the chilies can be highly variable, and there can be 3 or 4 weeks between the first and the last popping up, even of the same variety. And then different varieties take typically different amounts of time, but some of these will be up pretty quick and others will linger. So at both ends of the growing period, there's quite some variability. So getting the timing right is always a little bit difficult. And then of course, you've got to judge how long you need to grow these plants on to get to the perfect stage for planting out. And that all depends on the conditions you can offer them. If you've got them in decent sized pots, in due course, of course, not to begin with, but eventually you get them in decent sized pots. If you keep them in good, warm, reasonably well lit conditions, those plants grow on without a check and they're growing well, then sowing, I think, at this sort of stage in the latter half of January, for me, that works out pretty well. I wouldn't want to do it any earlier. I think I sowed middle of January last year, and because we had a pretty cold start to May, I was having to hold the plants back, and they were quite a bit bigger than they ideally would be. And it's always difficult at that time to hold the plants back because you've got all the peppers and the aubergines and then all of the tomatoes as well. And at that point, probably melons and summer squash, all of that needs protection from the frost. And ideally for the peppers and chilies, you've got to keep the temperature, well, ideally above 12 degrees. 10 as a bit of a minimum. They can survive a little dip below that, of course, but they won't like it down there. So to keep them happy and growing away, you've got to keep that temperature up. So that means all of our heated propagators are in use to keep the chill off of the peppers and chilies. So it all gets a bit crowded and a bit messy. So the last thing I want is plants too early. And I think anywhere from mid-January to mid-February is a pretty good time to sow these, if you're then keeping them in conditions where they're going to be quite happy to grow away. And usually we do manage to provide quite nice conditions for them. It does depend on the weather a little bit, but I don't want to get them started sort of first week of January. It's a little bit too soon, or even earlier. I mean, some people I know start them even sooner. And there are some chilies in particular that are really slow, but I'm not growing any of those slow varieties. I think things like the habaneros and they can be a bit slower to grow and to fruit. So I think those sorts of chilies I might think about starting a little bit earlier, but not the ones I'm growing today. They're all pretty quick to get going. Anyway, that's enough waffle about the sowing point. I certainly wouldn't want to do it any earlier this year than where I'm at now. Varieties, well, this is a little bit mad. I've got 13 varieties here. I think that's one less than last year. So the main changes are that I'm not growing any bell peppers this year. So last year in the main greenhouses I had the Asti bell peppers, and then I had the Corno de Toro, the bull's horn types, both red and yellow. The bull's horn peppers, they did much better than the bell peppers. So this year I'm just going to keep to the bull's horn peppers. So I've taken 2 varieties out there, but I've added one back in, that's sweet banana. I haven't grown that for a few years, but we used to grow it quite regularly. That's one of those where the green fruit, to my taste, isn't too bad. I'm not that keen on green bell peppers or the green bull's horn peppers. I find them a little bit bitter. I'd much rather allow them to ripen. But of course, that does take a long time because they're quite big fruit. It takes a long time for the fruit to mature and then even longer to ripen. So you've got to wait for those. Sweet banana, every time we've grown it in the past, it's been pretty prolific. They will ripen to red eventually, but they're very nice it's one of those pale green fruits, quite pleasant. That's the only changes to the varieties. Now, I need a ridiculous number of plants. I think I've got here 76 plants, which is a little bit mad, but I must have had something like that last year. So in the main greenhouses, I'll grow red in one again and yellow in the other. I think I probably want 12 plants in each. I certainly want at least 10. So I will allow for 12 there. And then in the polytunnel, I think I'll put the aubergines in there again. I've got 3 varieties, I'll do 2 each of those. And I'll put half a dozen sweet banana in there, so that's another 12. And then in the smaller greenhouse, that's where I do the propagation early in the year. But it's what we call the chili house, because later on that's going to be rammed with chilies and peppers. And I'm going to try and get about 40 varieties in there. So that's 76 in total. And of course, I was debating how I'm going to start these off. There's so many plants that it would be really convenient to set these out in seed trays or then fairly small cell trays and then prick them out or pot them on whenever they are ready to go. But I've got the perennial problem of light versus heat. So room temperature is pretty good for germinating chilies and peppers. Ideally, you'd want to push that up to 25, 26, maybe even just a little bit more. That's centigrade, of course. I can get that temperature easily indoors. I've got a propagator set up here, and that will give a fairly constant, nice toasty temperature for them. I've got that set to 26. I think that's probably enough. I've got that in what is probably the brightest part of the house, in front of some patio doors in the kitchen, and there's plenty of light there, but not enough for these seedlings. When they start to pop up, they will bend towards the light and they will stretch out, and then I end up with leggy seedlings. Now I know, of course, you can bury those seedlings deep as the seed leaves, for sure, and sometimes that can even be a beneficial thing, but I would much rather produce strong, stocky plants if I can. Now the light is better, of course, down the greenhouse. I mean, it's only coming from one way. I get morning sun there, and then I get no direct light after about midday. Down the greenhouse, I'm getting better light. It's not great at this time of year, of course, but these fellas won't be up for a couple of weeks. but I'm not getting such good temperatures. So even though I've got the heated propagators in there, there's a limit to how much of a lift they can provide above the ambient temperature. And for those, the specification is 12 degrees, which isn't bad, but I mean, at the moment, the nighttime temperatures are dropping, well, they're regularly going just below -2. It looks like we've got -4 coming up in a couple of days. So those nighttime temperatures are pretty low. So I think the propagators, they're in the greenhouse, and that gives them another couple of degrees. So they're running, I think, at the moment about 14 degrees above ambient. So during the daytime, it's fine. They come up to a nice, sensible sort of temperature. But at night, they'll dip down to maybe as low as 12, 13 degrees, which isn't ideal. So I've got good light, worse temperature, or indoors, I've got better temperature and worse light. So the only conclusion is that I germinate indoors, and as soon as they're up, move them down to the greenhouse. The conditions there will be perfectly fine for these to grow on, but they're not quite as good for germination. And of course, as these germinate, you know, it's only a couple of weeks, but at this time of year, that does make a bit of difference to the light levels. That will keep improving, and possibly also we'll get out of this frosty period. So I think that's what I did last year. That's what I'm going to do this year. But that dictates what I sow into, because I can't use a seed tray or cell trays because of the difference in time between the first one germinating and the last one popping up. That's not going to work. I would have to leave them in here until they're all up, by which time the first ones will be long and leggy again. So individual pots is what I'm doing again this year. It's a bit of a pain because they completely fill that propagator, and there's no room for anything else, but that's what I've got to do. So what I'm doing first is soaking my seeds. Now, I've done this for years, and it's something I sort of came across through my own experiments, and it's not something I read about or it hadn't been recommended to me, but I had a few seedlings pop up, and the seed leaves were still trapped in their seed casings. And I thought, well, I wonder if I soak the seeds, whether that would help. And I got into the habit of setting out the seeds the night before and then sowing them the next day. So quite a long soak. I did experiments with that, and I think I got better results. So I've done it that way ever since. I did read last year, it was months ago, and I can't remember the details, I'm afraid, but I read a paper where they were presenting some empirical results of how long to soak the seeds for best germination. And it's not essential with chilies and peppers or aubergines. In fact, I usually don't bother to soak the aubergines. I think I might today, but I don't normally. So this is not required by any means. They will germinate quite happily without. I just find that I get slightly better results, and I rarely now get any seed leaves trapped in the seed case. It's probably my fault for keeping the compost a little bit too dry on those occasions. But anyway, this paper suggested that the optimal time was a few hours rather than the sort of 12 hours or more I was giving them. So today I'm going to just try that. I'm going to soak them for 3 hours. I can't remember where they concluded the optimum time was, and I can't be bothered to go searching for that paper again. So I'll do it for 3 hours today, and we'll see what happens. So in front of me, I've just got a collection of glasses into which I shall slip some seed. I'll leave them there for 3 hours, then I'll come back and I will deposit those in their pots. So when you're sowing something like this, germination rates as well as time can be a little bit hit and miss. Some of the seed is new, but much of it is from last season. So every year that passes, germination rate can drop a little bit. So you can either sow more seed than you need, especially if you're using a seed tray, that's dead easy. Or you can sow more seed per cell or pot. So I'm going to do what I usually do, and I will stick in 3 seeds in each pot. It's probably a little bit excessive. 2 is probably fine, but I've got plenty of seed for most of these varieties, and I think if I start with 3 in each pot, most of those pots are going to give me 3 little seedlings, and I can pick the best looking specimen and pull the other 2 out. It's not a problem, but I would rather be pretty confident that every pot is going to have a plant in than risk having too few. Having said that, I will also sow some spares. I think it's pretty rare to lose an actual plant, so it's quite common to have some slightly rubbish germination, but once they're up, I don't remember the last time I lost a chili or pepper plant. So I think I will just have 1 spare of each variety. That is still plenty of sowing to do. So all I need to do now is go through the varieties, count out the seeds and get them in soaking. So I shall work my way down my sowing list because of course the quantities differ depending on the varieties I'm growing. Right, Corno Rosso. So I need 39 of these seeds, and I will count them out, but I also want to make sure I've got no rubbish seeds in here. So I want 39 good looking seeds. It's a tedious old job, but I like to take my time over this and do it right. See, I don't like that seed. That is moody looking. I'm going to discard that one. Here we go. 9. Right, that's plenty. So those I shall return. These packs came from Seeds of Italy, and they've always got lots of seed in there, so these will be old before I finish sowing them, I think. But even with the old seed, it's always worth, you can throw the end of the bag in a seed tray and see whether anything comes up. Sometimes it does. So a label in the glass, and they can just soak in there for 3 hours or so. Well, I'm not going to make you sit through 13 lots of that. I'm just going to carry on. The way I sow my chilies and peppers, it's a little bit fiddly, a little bit time consuming. That's the way I've always done it, and it works well for me, so I'm happy to carry on that way. I know it's much quicker just to empty a packet of seed on top of a seed tray, but this is one of my most important crops after the tomatoes, so I like to take my time and hopefully get it right. Hello, well, I'm back again and nearly ready to sow. I realised I didn't actually run through all of the varieties. I'll do that now, and I'll leave a list in the video description. So in the 2 main greenhouses, I shall put Corno Rosso and Corno Giallo, the red and yellow bull's horn types. Then in the polytunnel, I'll have the 6 sweet banana that I mentioned earlier, and then 2 each of the aubergines, Violetta di Firenze, Rosa Sfumata, both Italian varieties, and then the long purple. So the first two I grew last year. I haven't grown long purple for a while, but I'll have 2 each of those. And then in the chili house, the 3 Italian varieties that I grew last year, Dolce de Bergamo, Lombardo and Friggitello, all 3 were pretty good last year. I'm going to do just a few more of the Bergamo. If anything, I would find that one just a little bit more useful. And then I've got 4 chilies. So I've got the Hungarian hot wax, the Gorria pepper, that's the Basque chili pepper, Joe's Long and Padron, that's exactly the same as last year. Maybe I'll change a few varieties for next year, just for something different. But those 4, I find them pretty useful in the kitchen actually. They're quite versatile varieties, those, and they all do fairly well for us. So that is that. Now this process, frankly, is a faff because of course the seeds are now wet and that makes them awkward to handle. They stick to your fingers. It's a bit of a pain. So I'll just sieve the seeds out. And actually I found that the easiest way to deal with these now is with a little pair of tweezers. As long as you're gentle, it doesn't damage the seeds at all. So I've got small pots here and I made these up yesterday. I've got my usual sort of sowing mix, so it's a blend of sieved multi-purpose, coir and a little bit of vermiculite. So it's not a bad mix, even though it's sieved. There are occasionally some lumps of junk in it, of course, because that sort of stuff quite easily goes through the sieve. But I filled these yesterday. I gave them a good soaking yesterday and then I put them in a propagator. So they've been there for more or less 24 hours now. So these are all nice and warm. These have been sat at about 26 degrees. Then they're warm and they're moist, so perfect to sow in. I don't need to do anything else other than just insert the seeds. So I can, first of all, I'll just place them on the surface. I'll give them just a little bit of space so that when I pull out the excess ones, I don't disturb the others. But that's that. And of course they are all clumping together in here because they're wet now. So there's no quick and easy way to do it, I don't think, but it's not a bad little job. I don't mind doing this. Just need a little bit of patience. It's a good job for when the weather is moody outside. Actually, the weather's quite nice today, but it is freezing. Right, having done that, all I need to do is just push those slightly under the surface and then just close the compost around them. The compost is already damp, so the seeds are soaked, so they are good to go. Don't want to push them too deep. Just want to make sure that they are in really good contact with that soil. But otherwise this is a fairly quick job. So there they are in the propagator, and they'll stay here until I see the first signs of growth, and then I'll get them down to the greenhouse. I'll have to keep a close eye on them, because if you miss them for just a day or two in this position, they will really stretch out, and I want to try and avoid that. So I'll move individual pots down as soon as I can. Right, that job is done. So slightly odd method, perhaps. It's the only thing I sow in quite this fussier manner. Everything else I do in a slightly more conventional way, but when you find a method that works for you, it's probably a good idea to stick with it. Anyway, that is all for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.